Good afternoon, brothers and sisters. We're just happy to be with you this morning. We're happy to be with you and to be with Jeffrey Perry, who is going to do part 2 of the life and times of Hubert Harris. And we're gonna spend all our time with Jeffrey. Jeffrey, give us a little of your background so we'll know who we're learning from. Because I'm telling you, you have done more research on Hubert Harris than anybody I know, and your dedication to his work and to the work of early African-centered historians is phenomenal, and we certainly appreciate you. So we're just glad to be with you again this week. So, Jeffrey, a little bit about yourself, and then how you really got into Hubert Harris and African-centered scholars, which has been a great part of your life. Jeffrey?
Well, thank you, Clemson, so much for hosting this, and thank you, Darrell, for producing this and for helping to bring Hubert Harris into current and future generations. He's that important, I think. As for myself, I've been working on Hubert Harrison for about 38 years. I describe myself as an anti-white supremacist, working class, intellectual activist and archivist. And I was working in the post office for 33 years, and that's where it was when I started working on Harrison. I came across some articles written about him by Joel A. Rogers, by Richard B. Moore, and by Philip Foner. And I, like many, probably said, who is this fella? I hadn't heard much about him. So I started researching. I was able to track down his children, 2 of whom were still alive, one in Harlem and one in New Rochelle. We met on the 3rd meeting. They said for me to take his papers and do with them what I needed to do. And I preserved them and archived them and inventoried them. And ultimately, we placed them at Columbia University's Rare Book and Manuscript Library, which is where they are now, over 100 boxes. And I also placed, and part of the agreement was that they would put Harrison's, or at least a good portion of Harrison's papers online. And Columbia proceeded to do that only last year, but they've got over 1,300 items up, Harrison's writings, photos, and included in those materials is Harrison's diary, which they gave to me at a later date, but it's an extraordinary document of over 200 pages available for free for people to read and learn from. And so I worked on Harrison for 38 years, and I've written a few books, a 2-volume biography, which I'm going to show you the front covers of in a second. But Hubert Harrison, The Voice of Harlem Radicalism, which came out in 2008, and most recently, and that one covers 1883 to 1918, and the second one, Hubert Harrison, The Struggle for Equality, which covers the last 8.5 years of his life, 9.5 years of his life, 1918 to 1927. They're for Columbia University Press. I also published with Wesleyan University Press a Hubert Harrison Reader, which has 138 of his articles. I've located some 700 Harrison articles, a prolific and brilliant writer. And also I published, and I'm going to throw up the front covers of these books, with Diasporic Africa Press out of Brooklyn. We reprinted an edition of Hubert Harrison's When Africa Awakes, the inside story of the stirrings and strivings of the new Negro in the Western world. So we're getting off me. I went and I picked up some degrees along the way, but that's not so important right now. Here we are with Hubert Harrison. And I'm going to show these opening slides. I showed them last time, but this is just for those people who are coming for the first time. He lives from 1883 to 1927. He is a brilliant intellectual writer, speaker, reviewer, and activist. He is race and class conscious. He's a radical internationalist. He is known as the father of Harlem radicalism, and he is a key ideological link in the civil rights / Black liberation movement. He will continue to grow in importance in the 21st century. Next slide, please. Yeah. For more information, I have a website, which is simply my name, jeffreybperry.net. Has a lot of free material, audio, video, articles, interviews, and up and down the sides and across the top. The interested person can just go and find all kinds of fascinating and enlightening material primarily about Hubert Harrison, but also about another person I write about, Theodore W. Allen, who authored 2 major books on the invention of the white race. And Harrison and Allen both, I think, are 2 of the most important thinkers on race and class in the 20th century. And they are both autodidacts, self-educated, working class intellectuals, anti-white supremacists. Next slide, please. This is volume 1, completed in 2008, Columbia University Press. This one only runs 600 plus pages, but it's a major contribution, I think, The Voice of Harlem Radicalism, 1883 to 1918. And if you read the back cover, I didn't put it up there, but it's got tremendous comments and blurbs from leading academics and activists. And the book, as all the work I do, I try to very meticulously footnote so people can, if they see something that interests them, they can dig a little deeper and learn more and develop it, more. So that's volume 1. And one last thing, this picture was taken in 1918 when Hubert Harrison was at something that he co-chaired with the man on his right, who's William Monroe Trotter. And it's the Liberty Congress of 1918. It was the major Black protest effort during World War I. And in the book, and I think maybe in today's slideshow even, I'm not sure, we have a picture of a full picture of many of the people at that Congress as it was convened. Next slide, please. This is the current book that just most recently came out. And this is Hubert Harrison. The Struggle for Equality covers the last 9.5 years of his life. The Struggle for Equality, 1918 to 1927, also Columbia University Press. Again, many leading activists, historians of Harlem, scholars have written nice blurbs on the back and elsewhere. And in this book, which we're going to deal in forthcoming sessions, we learn about Harrison really developing the new Negro movement, as it was called back then, his work as editor of Marcus Garvey's Negro World, and then his work as an independent scholar and activist and speaker and writer extraordinaire, if you will. He dies young in 1927 from an appendicitis-related condition in Bellevue Hospital in New York. Next slide, please. This is a Hubert Harrison reader. This is the first book I did on Harrison. This is in 2001. And it includes 138 of his articles with introductions, which I provide. Again, very seriously end-noted, I guess it is. And it's from Wesleyan University Press. Next slide. This book is Harrison's When Africa Awakes, which he wrote in 1920. And he subtitled it The Inside Story of the Stirrings and Strivings of the New Negro in the Western World. It's published by Diasporic Africa Press out of Brooklyn, New York. And it's got, I did the appendixes and some notes, and it's a major work. And I want to call your attention to the subtitle, because the book includes 53 articles, I believe it is, on Harrison's writings on the New Negro movement from the period from 1917 to 1920. Note the dates. These are Alain Leroy Locke doesn't come out with the publication The New Negro until 1925. And Locke's publication is primarily a literary publication. But here we have Harrison with over 50 articles of course, Harrison's writings are literary, but they're also very political, and they're published 5 to 7, 8 years before Locke's publication. I'll also call the viewer's attention to the tricolor flag in the left-hand corner there, and the colors are black, brown, and yellow, and they're the colors of Hubert Harrison's Liberty League, which he founds in 1917. And those colors, he says, were because they're the colors of the Negro race, with black, brown, and yellow, and also of people of color worldwide. Very profound, symbol. And from his tricolor, Marcus Garvey subsequently switched to the red, black, and green, which people know today as the Black Liberation colors. And Harrison offers some comments on that, which we'll discuss in one of the forthcoming sessions. Next slide. Okay, we're going to discuss Harrison's Crucian roots. He is from St. Croix in the Virgin Islands. It was U.S. Danish West Indies when he was born in 1883. Next slide. He's born on Estate Concordia in 1883. It was a capitalist sugar production plantation. Here's a photo of that plantation from 1869. In my 40 years of research, it took me many various continents, various repositories, and this photo I was able to obtain from a descendant of the family who owned this plantation, which, by the way, was a family, 2 people of color owned this plantation, and the descendants were living outside Paris, France. And up in the closet, they said, "Oh, yeah, let's take a look what we have here." And they shared with me a number of things, including this image of the Concordia estate, Concordia plantation, which is from 14 years before Harrison was born. Next slide, please. What it's good to know, and people may not know, is St. Croix, in the time of Harrison's birth and years there, functioned around capitalist agriculture, and it had a rich background in slavery. Slavery had been abolished in the 1840s in an enslaved-led emancipation victory. But it was a colony of Denmark, and as a colony, only 475 out of 23,000 people had the right to vote. African customs were still very common and predominated for the plantation working people. And Harrison writes about this in his books. And I have some I discussed this in volume 1 of the biography, and also in that Hubert Harrison Reader, I quote some Harrison articles where he describes this. What's very important to know is the color line and social control in St. Croix is very different than in the United States. In St. Croix, there were few Europeans, quote, colored, were served in the militia, and there was a policy of promotion, not proscription, for a sector of the African-American descended population. Very different than the U.S. I'll speak more on this in a second. There is a rich history of direct action mass struggle in St. Croix, and in Harrison's own life experience, he also was impacted by the immigrant experience because his mother, while living in St. Croix, was an immigrant from Barbados, and he lived in amongst other Barbadian immigrants, on Concordia. So next slide, please. Okay, when I say the color line was drawn differently in St. Croix, the policy of promotion, not strict proscription. There was no formal segregation in St. Croix. There was no history of lynch terror. White supremacy was not as virulent or as organized as in the U.S. Next slide. The reasons are the population of St. Croix was 5% was European background, fully European background, if you will. 15% of the population was, quote, colored, of mixed African and European ancestry, and 80% of the population was Black. The greatly outnumbered European ruling elite, for social control reasons, implemented a policy of promotion of a sector of the African-descended population. They wanted help in maintaining social control. Next slide. A little bit more on this topic. There was a policy of promotion and landholding for a sector of the African-descended population. Free-colored in St. Croix served in the militia, which was the principal instrument of social control. And in 1834, free-colored were extended an edict of full equality. A law was passed granting, at least nominally, full equality to free-coloreds. In contrast, in the U.S., the general policy was one of severe racial prescriptions for African Americans. Slave patrols were lily white, no black people involved in the slave patrols, and Negroes, quote, as codified in the Dred Scott decision of 1856-57, had no rights that a white was bound to respect. So there was no edict of full equality at all. Next slide. Oh, and one thing I'd just like to say for the reader, it's, you're able to stop at any point when you're looking at these slides in the future and take time to read carefully if sometimes the slides get too dense or you want to stop and I say something, you want to look it up or anything. That's one of the virtues of using these slides. This is the estate where Harrison was born, Concordia, and it's owned by two men of color, and that's some of the workforce on that sugar producing estate. Also from 1869, photo which I obtained from the descendants of the owner, one of the two owners, when I went to France. Next slide. That's a picture of Concordia in 1869, also from the family that owned the estate. And it's tough to see, but it's basically very modest little housing for the laboring population. And next slide. We have a picture of Budo, who in 1848 was an emancipation leader. St. Croix, for a host of reasons, which I go into in volume 1, had, I believe it was the second enslaved-led emancipation victory in the Americas after Haiti. And one of the leaders was this man named Budo. And that's a picture or a rendition of what he looked like. Next slide. They had other militant struggles. Again, St. Croix has a rich history of direct action mass struggle. In 1878, they had a major struggle. They called it the fire burn, and it burned a number of the plantations. And one of the leaders was Queen Mary Thomas. Here's a portrait of her that was done by someone along the way, a leader of the 1878 struggle. And interestingly, a friend of mine from the post office where I worked also, as did Harrison later on, as did Allen, was a Thomas and was a descendant of Queen Mary Thomas. Next slide. The 1878 struggle, which was called the Great Fire Burn, was followed by a general strike in 1879. So the island had this rich history of struggle against domination by the ruling elite. Okay, next slide. And Harrison, this is the environment that Harrison grows up in. Now, when he grows up, one of his close friends is a fellow named D. Hamilton Jackson, who is a major figure in St. Croix history. And he led a general strike in 1916, which was instrumental in the break from Danish colonial rule. And he and Harrison were good friends. They were about a year apart. I think Harrison was a year older. And when Jackson came to the States on his way to Denmark to try and negotiate some demands, he'd stop and see Harrison. He would leave outlines of his plans for the work he would do, and Harrison and Jackson stayed very much in touch. Next slide. Harrison commented in his papers on the Black people of the Virgin Islands. And he says these Black people of the Virgin Islands are almost entirely of African extraction, and their social characteristics are only adequately understood and appreciated by similar reference to characteristics to be found in the West African Negroes, from among whom the slaves of the Danish islands were mainly drawn, the locale extending from the upper Gold Coast to the southeastern limits of Nigeria. And he talks about that more. And one of the main groups that were living or had ancestors living in St. Croix were the Akan people. Next slide. Amongst the customs rooted in the African communal system, Harrison speaks of a free public garden on every plantation. So even though these people are working on plantations, which were stocked with fruit trees, mangoes, mammy apples, soursops, avocados, sugar apples, and bananas, there was to be had for the picking fishes and shrimps in any gut or gutter, right, or stream was just as free. Every family of agricultural laborers had its own half acre of provision land on which yams, tannies, okras, and potatoes were produced as additions to the regular dietary, the surplus being regularly disposed of in the towns on Saturday. So there'd be a Saturday market, which was a weekly holiday, in markets that exactly reproduced those to be found today in the hinterlands of Sierra Leone, Liberia, the Cameroons, and the Yoruba. So again, Harrison knew and always was associating and making ties between his St. Croix experience and his African roots. Next slide, please. His mother, Cecilia Elizabeth Haynes, sometimes spelled Haynes, was born in Barbados. On his birth certificate, it leaves blank both the space for listing the baby's father and that for his mother's occupation. It clearly suggests that Cecilia was not formally married at the time and she had no formal occupation. She was a plantation worker, an immigrant from Barbados, and there was quite a number of them in the area where Harrison was born. And like other poor women on the island, she probably did agricultural and domestic work and had principal responsibility for her children. Next slide. She wound up having three other female childs and two male childs, but she dies in 1899, and she was 35 at the time. Her death record indicates she was 35 at Hubert's birth. Cecilia, her parents, were among the Bayesian workers who came to St. Croix in the post-emancipation period in Barbados of the 1840s and 1860s. After Estate Concordia, she lived in the Christiansted area, which is the capital city, and church documents place her in Lebanon Hill in 1875, Judas Fancy in 1881, Concordia in 1883, where Hubert Harrison is born, and Orange Grove, where she died in 1899. Next slide. When Hubert was 6, his mother married Robert Collins, a laborer, in a December 22nd, 1889 ceremony recorded at St. John's Church. So she didn't really have much contact with the biological father at all. Go on, next. The biological father was Adolphus Harrison, who had been born enslaved circa 1844, probably on Estate Breton. He moved to Estate Concordia with his mother and his younger brother. In the 1870s, he fathered 3 children with another woman, and he dies in September 1891. Next slide. Little else is known of Hubert's biological parents, but J.A. Rogers commented that they were of apparently unmixed African descent. They were likely English speakers, as were 90% of the island inhabitants. Despite the fact that St. Croix was a Danish possession, English was the predominant tongue. Next slide. Harrison got a lot of his early education just finding learning where he could. And when he was living in Christiansted, the capital, he would oftentimes go to St. John's Episcopal Church, and it played an important part in his early education. His sister remembered him befriending the pastor there, who granted him access to the institution's library, and Hubert would go in there and read from the library's books. And this at a very early age, pre-10, right? Next slide. Here's a picture of the church, still standing, still an important institution in St. Croix in Christiansted. Next slide. And Hubert benefited up to a point from the Crucian educational system. In St. Croix, there was no formal segregation. And I'm saying this in terms or in contrast to what many African Americans had to face and deal with in the U.S., particularly the U.S. South, right? In St. Croix, there was no formal segregation in the schools, and instruction was free, compulsory to age 13, and since 1850 in English. School records no longer exist, but the Chicago Defender reported that Harrison started private school at age 6, and in 1890 attended an Anglican school. His education then continued in a Danish government school at East Hill, where one of his schoolmates was D. Hamilton Jackson. And it was in that period he probably came in close contact with Jackson's father, Wilfred Jackson, who was considered the finest educator on the island, quote, black or white. And so Harrison had the advantage of getting some good education and learning from one of the top teachers on the island. He also did some work as a student teacher. And he also, for a period in 1892, studied in St. Time when he was on that neighboring island, another Danish West Indies island at that in that period. Next slide. Wilfred Jackson was D. Hamilton Jackson's father, and he taught and presided over the Danish school at East Hill. Hubert later described the senior Jackson as perhaps the most prominent teacher, white or black, in the 3 Danish West Islands. He was probably an important figure in Hubert's early intellectual growth. That's what I was just trying to describe. Next slide. Now, in Christiansted, Harrison lived for a period in what's called the water gut section. And this is a photo, this is not Hubert, but this is a photo from 1895 of what conditions were like for a family in the water gut section. Very poor, very modest living. And again, water gut, a gut is a short for gutter. It's where the water flows, you know, as it's moving past Christiansted out to the sea. Next slide. Hubert Harrison commented on living in poverty, and he's so perceptive and humble, I think, sometimes in some of the things he calls attention to and he writes about. And he writes, "I have often thought that this contact with the stern realities of poverty was good for me. It has kept my heart open to the call of those who are down and has kept me from giving myself such airs as might make a chasm between myself and my people." Next slide. So the broad shaping influence of St. Croix on Harrison it was a monocultural economy centered on sugar, and the pressures of capitalism weighed heavily on laboring peoples, who, as colonial subjects, had no formal say about the governing of the island. Some African communal customs helped to lessen the pressure, but the main forces that had historically checked exploitation and oppression was mass struggle by those at the bottom of society. While blacks were in general at the bottom of the color line, and the color line was drawn differently in St. Croix than in the U.S. Next slide. Due in large part to the history of struggle and social control needs, St. Croix had no history of lynch terror and no formal segregation. Some class development among people of African descent was fostered, and white supremacy was not as virulent or as organized as in the U.S. The young black youth on St. Croix could grow with experiences significantly different than a counterpart youth in the U.S., particularly in the southern U.S. The specifics of Hubert Harrison's early years make this clear. Slide. On January 30th, 1899, he lost his mother, Cecilia Collins, formerly Haynes. Her death affected the 15-year-old deeply, and he noted the exact minute in his diary. He started 7 years later. Next slide. After the death of his mother, his sister Mary sent for him. She had preceded him to New York. And this was a pattern that we see oftentimes in families from St. Croix and other Anglo-Caribbean islands, where the pace setter in coming to the U.S. is oftentimes a female in the family, and she paves the way for others. And this was the case with Hubert's family and his sister Mary. And he arrives in 1900, and there may have been some little delay, which I go into all the specifics of what might have happened, but he arrives in 1900. Next slide. He arrives shortly after a, quote, race riot in New York. It was the fourth major race riot in New York history. His sister was living in the West 60s at the time, which was the principal area of African-American and Afro-Caribbean residents. This is before the IRT subway got built, which went up to Harlem, right? So this area in the 60s was a major area of Black concentration. And when he arrives, he goes to live with her in the West 60s. But the so-called race riot made it almost impossible for a Black person to walk between 42nd and 59th Street without fear of being attacked by a white mob. This according to the New York press, various papers. Next slide. When he lives in the West 60s, he lives on West 62nd. I couldn't get a photo of the building he lived into, but this building is on 63rd Street, one block away. And they've been described in various books by historians as the meanest tenements of New York. Again, this is where the African-American, Afro-Caribbean population lived. This building from West 63rd Street is actually an improved building because it has, and we're looking from, an inner courtyard where if you had an inside apartment, you could get some fresh air. And it was on West 63rd Street a little over a decade later that Thelonious Monk grows up. So there's a rich history of some other people of note that grow up in this area. But this is where Harrison lived when he lived with his sister for a while. Next slide. The year that Harrison arrived, at least 107 African Americans were lynched in the U.S. In this photo, 4 unidentified African Americans were lynched, and this is from a book on lynching, which is, and some photos. The photos are available. And lynching was something, as I said, that Harrison didn't know in St. Croix, and he was utterly shocked when he learned about it, read about it, and he wrote very early how it shocked him, and it stayed with him. Next slide, please. Harrison indicates his shock with lynching, and Claude McKay explained, similar to Harrison in many respects. Claude McKay comes from Jamaica, and his experience in coming to the U.S. was similar to Harrison's. And McKay writes, "It was the first time I had ever come face to face with such manifest, implacable hatred of my race, and my feelings were indescribable. I had heard of prejudice in America, but never dreamed of it being so intensely bitter." Next slide. Marcus Garvey similarly wrote, and this is in 1916, "Jamaica is unlike the United States where the race question is concerned. We have no open race prejudice here, and we do not openly antagonize one another. The extremes here are not between white and Black, hence we have never had a case of lynching or anything so desperate." I find these comments very interesting and perhaps enlightening for a U.S. audience, who sometimes we think, well, gee, things are here and they're always the same everywhere. And it's important to notice that there are important differences between the experiences of Harrison, McKay, and Garvey down in the Anglo-Caribbean islands and then when they come here. Next slide. Harrison began, when he got to New York, he had no money. He was living with his sister, and he started working. And he was working, picked up various jobs. And essentially, he was working full-time menial jobs and sometimes working a couple of nights also. And he also went to high school. I think he finished. He never finished high school, as far as I know, but he went to school. And while going to school, he got citywide honors in a couple of subjects. And a headline in one of the New York dailies said, "Genius found in West Indian student." Harrison also, in the period from 1903 to 1910, on his own, wrote 14 letters that were published in the New York Times. And he explained that when the Negro enters fully into the intellectual life of white American, the customary barriers based on the assumption of his inferiority tend to break down. When he's writing in the paper, they don't know for sure who he is, right? So they got to judge him by the merits of what he writes to a certain degree, although his topics were generally very, telltale, if you will. Next slide. What influences Harrison very much in his first decade in New York are the intellectual circles he frequents. And in particular, the lyceums of St. Benedict's Lyceum and another lyceum on West 53rd Street. And these church lyceums, St. Benedict was St. Benedict the Moor Roman Catholic Church, but they held these weekly lyceums where people would come and speak, or members of the group would speak, and they'd have freewheeling and open discussion. They'd debate and discuss and enlighten each other. And other people involved in these lyceums were Arturo Alfonso Schomburg, who's, of course, famous for his work in building what is now the Schomburg Center on 135th Street in New York. And he's born in Puerto Rico, but again, many people may not know his mother is from St. Croix, and she was of the Joseph family. Next slide. Another person involved, next slide, is John E. Bruce, who's a journalist, a messenger, and a lay historian. And you'll see Schomburg, Bruce, these are all working class Black intellectuals. I think Schomburg was a clerk, Bruce is a messenger. And at St. Benedict's Lyceum, he also attended, and he would stay in close touch with Harrison over another thing. And he was a leading Black journalist in this period. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, Harrison said that St. Benedict's Lyceum was the intellectual center of Negro New York and the germ of Black racial consciousness. He describes how the fiercest opposition and debate could not take from the cordiality of personal friendship. He learned to insist on the right to differ, to criticize, and to dissent from that which we believe to be wrong, and do this openly and publicly without beating the devil round the stump. And this would be something that would stay with Harrison for the remainder of his life. And so he would quite freely and openly express his opinions, and many people were not used to it, and they took umbrage. They didn't quite know how to handle it. But Harrison was, in general, trying to just move understanding, further, deep in understanding. And what's also significant for these lyceums is they were meeting places for African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans. And this is in a period when there was some tension between the two groups, the Afro-Caribbeans being a new immigrant group or groups in New York. Next slide. Others involved in the lyceums at St. Mark's Lyceum, the other lyceum on West 53rd Street, was George Young, who's another laboring class intellectual. He's a Pullman porter and a bookseller, and he had a stand of books on Black history and Africana history, African history, on West 135th Street that numbered, I believe it was said, 12,000 books. And he's a great bibliophile, and he was one of the people who helped donate a significant portion of materials to to what became the Schomburg Center in its early years. But a very outstanding bibliophile. Next slide. Also attending these lyceums was Williana Jones Burroughs. She's a New York City school teacher. She's a unionist. She becomes a candidate for office later on. And during World War II, when the U.S. is at war with Germany, she becomes a radio host in the Soviet Union in English, trying to get out word on the situation in wartime. And an outstanding Black radical activist and a notable female activist. And she marries, next slide, Charles Burroughs, who's a close friend of Hubert Harrison, who, like Harrison, is a postal worker. Harrison starts work in the post office in 1907, and he works until 1911, when he's summarily fired through the efforts of Booker T. Washington. I'll discuss this a little more later. And Burroughs is a close friend of Harrison. He had been a student of Du Bois, close to Du Bois. He's an actor. He's involved with the Croix Players, which is one of the first theater groups in Harlem. And he and his wife, their son, co-founds the DuSable Museum in Chicago. This is some years later. And one thing I've always found interesting was, because I used to do this when I worked in the post office, Charles Burroughs and Hubert Harrison and other postal workers would get off those midnight shifts and then go perhaps to Harrison's apartment someplace else, and they would have study groups at 2, 3, 4 in the morning after work, reading and discussing. And in the case of these study groups, Harrison mentions at times where they're contacting people in Cuba, where there was a Black independent party, and they were corresponding with them. It's just the kind of working class radical intellectualism, which I think has tremendous appeal still for this day and is a model for many. Next slide. So William and Charles Burroughs had 4 children, and their son Charles, along with his wife Margaret, founded Chicago's famous DuSable Museum of African American History in 1957. Next slide. So the tradition gets carried on in the families, if you will. Okay, this is a little, I'm going to just shorthand this a lot, but Harrison was deeply moved and influenced by the Brownsville incident, when it was President Roosevelt's conduct in the wake of the August 13th, 1906 raid on Brownsville, Texas, by about a dozen men whom white witnesses alleged were Black. And following that, Roosevelt immediately interceded and threatened all African-American troops at nearby Fort Brown. And then on November 5th, the day after the 1906 congressional and state elections, with insufficient evidence, Roosevelt dishonorably discharged from the Army and disbarred from future enlistment or government employment all 167 men of these companies of Black troops of the 25th Regiment, including 6 Medal of Honor winners. Action was taken without courts-martial and deprived the men of future civil service, employment, and outraged the African-American community. It was not until 66 years later, in 1972, after congressional action, that the Secretary of the Army cleared these men. But for Harrison, For the remainder of his life, he never supported the Republicans. He never forgot Brownsville. And in criticizing the Republicans, he would often cite Brownsville. Next slide. Harrison worked then for a period at the White Rose Home for Ladies in Manhattan. And there's a photo. It was a place where colored working girls could go and live, and also have a place, if they had children, where their children could be left and cared for and have nursery school or even some classes. And it was particularly utilized by women coming up from the South or from the Caribbean. And the woman who heads it when Harrison's there, is Frances Reynolds Kaiser, who's an outstanding woman activist who a book really needs to be written about. She's in the bottom front center, if you will. She's got a white dress on. And she is, she's the first Black woman to graduate from what became Hunter College. She is a close friend of Victoria Earl Matthews, who's involved with this White Rose Home. She is a close friend of Paul Laurence Dunbar, so close that he sends materials to her for her comments before publication. And she later becomes prominent working with Mary McLeod Bethune. She is also a close friend and confidant of Hubert Harrison. So she's an extraordinary woman, and the White Rose Home really merits there's been a few articles on it, but it really merits much more attention. Next slide. There she is. There's a picture of her. She's also a founding member of the NAACP, and that's a photo of her. So Frances Reynolds Kaiser. Next slide, please. In 1907, Harrison begins his diary for the second time. He indicates he had started one earlier, but it was lost. So he starts his diary again in 1907. And this is it's an extraordinary document, as I mentioned. It's got over 200 pages in it. And let's do the next slide, and I'll talk a little more about it. He writes, when he restarted his diary, he wrote the following. I want to read this. It must surely be instructive to look back after long years on one's past thoughts and deeds and form new estimates of ourselves and others. Seen from another perspective, large things grow small, small ones large, and the lives of relative importance are bound to change position. At any rate, it must be instructive to compare the impression of the moment, laden as it may be with the bias of feeling and clouded by partisan or personal prejudice, with the more broad and impartial review which distance in time and space makes possible. This diary may serve in some sort as a history of myself, twisted as of two threads, what I do and what I think. I hope I shall not make any conscious effort to impress upon it a character of any sort. So far as life is concerned, as it comes, so must it be set down. And if I omit any one phrase of my life's experience, I do so for judicial reasons and not for the sake of seeming better in my own eyes when memory has ceased to testify. It's clear that while Harrison wrote his diary first for himself, there is no doubt from its content and occasional marginal comments that it was also written for those who would come after him, an indication that even as a young man, he both had a strong sense of self-worth and was aware of the importance of the work he undertook. As I've said, it's a remarkable document, and I encourage people to read it. One will get an education by simply reading Harrison's diary, which is available online at Columbia University's Rare Book and Manuscript Library digital collections. Next slide, please. In 1907, he also wrote a pledge. This is a young man. He's 24. To the mother race, from an untamed, untamable African. And it goes, and I'll read parts of it. Poor, heart-sore, and soul-starved mother race, who shall minister to thy deep desires? Who shall bind up thy wounds and raise thee up again, if these and such as these are to be the prophets and thy priests. O Africa, when shall be the terms of thy long degradation? Behold here, even now, I pledge thee, O my mother, that I shall devote my years to thee. He goes on, and then in the end he goes, take my youth, my labors, my love, my life, my all, and do thou, when I shall have died for thee, take me to thy bosom, an untamed, untamable African. Very powerful words, I think. Next slide. Last time Clemson said it would be nice if we throw some Reconstruction, discussion of Lincoln and Reconstruction. So I pulled some stuff together that's in volume 1, it's in the reader, and in volume 2. Forgive me for not having it as compact as I would like, but I'm just going to mention some things here because it's actually, Clemson, I want to thank you for calling my attention to this too, because I see how important Reconstruction and Lincoln and his criticisms of Lincoln were to Harrison's development. So in his diary, on November 25th, 1907, Harrison discusses his plans for this diary and this approach. He's going to start working on a history and of the American Negro and talk about Reconstruction. And he goes, this approach, this intimate involvement with the Black, overwhelmingly working class, this getting in full touch with the life of my people in order to understand them better, was one of the outstanding strengths and distinct features of Harrison as an intellectual. In a paragraph above that, he says, he's explaining how he's approaching his writing and thus my haunting of the YWCA, the YMCA, the White Rose Home, disreputable clubs, streets of evil, and sordid associations, my social work with the rest amongst the children of 62nd Street, and so on. Harrison immerses himself in the lives of the Black population, and so he's very much of the people as he seeks to write their history. Next slide. He proposes to write incidental volumes, and the first he says he wants to do is on the Negro and Reconstruction. And what he says back then in 1907, Reconstruction, he noted, has been treated, and please understand, Du Bois doesn't write his major book on Reconstruction until 1935, and he doesn't even write his major academic piece until 1909, 1910. I'll get into the dates in a second. But here's Harrison earlier than that. Reconstruction, he noted, had been treated both statically and dynamically as a social process and a political one, as a process of adjustment in a phase of national development. But no one, to his knowledge, had regarded it, this is to Harrison's knowledge, from the Negro side as a process of racial development, one phase of the progressive adjustment of a people to the life of another people. That is why he proposed to do that is what he proposed to do based on outlines that he had drawn up in May that served as a basis for his class work at the YMCA. Next slide. He delivered a Y talk on December 8th, 1908, still 1908, before Du Bois is putting out his stuff. And the Age, New York Age, Black Weekly in New York, described Harrison as a brilliant young man and a deep student of Reconstruction. Again, I repeat what I said in that last slide. He envisioned years of serious research. Next slide, please. Harrison, as a working class autodidact, began work on July 1st, 1907 as a postal clerk in New York at the General Post Office, which is on West 34th Street on the east side. And he would work there until 1911, when he was summarily fired through the efforts of Booker T. Washington, which we'll talk about. But Ralph Dumaine of the Autodidact Project wrote very perceptively that Harrison had admirable traits. He was a, quote, working class autodidact, a street agitator, an organizer, educator, critic, and He was closer to the Black working class than any other revolutionary intellectual of his time. Very insightful comment by Ralph Domain, I think. Next slide. Harrison's proposed volume on Negro Reconstruction. He was scheduled, forgive my misspelling, to deliver a series of lectures on Reconstruction beginning February 6, 1908. So he's now planning on delivering a series of lectures. Next slide. One interesting thing he does while he's in the process of doing his Reconstruction work is he writes a letter to Francis Reynolds Kaiser, whom I showed pictures of earlier, and it talks about his break from religion. This is a major break for Harrison because, and explains, I divorced myself from orthodox and institutional Christianity. What had gone was the authenticity of the Bible, which I had been taught was the Word of God. I had and he goes, oh, how my poor wounded soul cried out in agony. I saw the whole fabric of thought and feeling crumbling at its very foundations. But I had now had a new belief, agnosticism. I said belief. What I did mean was philosophy of life. Life, like Huxley, Harrison refused to put faith in that which does not rest on sufficient evidence. He chose instead to look the universe in the face, to believe in the sanctity of human nature, and to develop a deep sense of responsibility for his actions. As he explained, I prefer to go to the grave with my eyes open. Next slide. So this break from religion would shape the remainder of Harrison's life. And again, the Black church was the most powerful institution in Black community. So this is an utterly significant move by Harrison. He goes, now I'm agnostic as Thomas Huxley was, and my principles are the same. To Huxley, agnosticism was not a creed, but a method, the essence of which was the fundamental axiom of modern science. You follow your reason as far as it will take you, and do not pretend that conclusions are certain which are not demonstrated or demonstratable. Next slide. Free thought, for those not familiar with it, is thought free of religious dogma. It believes in the human origin of the Old and New Testaments. It denies the infallibility of the Bible, denies the existence of heaven and hell, emphasizes reason over supernatural authority, emphasizes free inquiry, free discussion, free publicity of ideas, and emphasizes the scientific method. Next slide. Next slide, please. In Harrison's years of living, if you will, there are a number of very notable freethinkers: Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, women suffragettes; Margaret Sanger, birth control advocate; Hugh Pendergast and Robert Ingersoll were orators; Horace Greeley, an anti-slavery editor; Thomas Wentworth Higginson, an abolitionist and Union Army colonel; Clarence Darrow, an attorney; Eugene Debs, a socialist; Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain, and Herbert Spencer, noted authors; Lucy Parsons and Emma Goldman, anarchists and labor activists; Louis Freina and Charles Ruthenberg, future communist leaders; A. Philip Randolph, future socialist, labor, and civil rights activist; and Carl Sandburg, a poet and historian. Next slide. There are also many important Black freethinkers, including J.A. Rogers, Claude McKay, Cyril Briggs, Richard B. Moore, Hodge Kiernan, and W.E.B. Du Bois, as indicated by his biographer, David Levering Lewis, was, quote, an agnostic and an anti-clerical. Next slide. Now, on Lincoln, Harrison quotes Lincoln in developing his overall criticism of the Republicans. And one book he relied on was a book by a woman named Mary McLean, which was published in 1903, which is available, I think, for free online now. It's Letters and Addresses of Abraham Lincoln. Excellent, excellent book. And McLean later became a leading activist with the NAACP managing editor of Crisis magazine, which Du Bois was the principal editor of, and one of the few close white friends of Du Bois until her untimely death in 1912. Next slide. Okay, some examples that Harrison would quote, and he would quote these in various publications. But this is one thing was quoting from Lincoln's August 27th, 1858, Freeport, Illinois debate with Stephen A. Douglas. This is the Lincoln-Douglas debates, in which Lincoln explained that he was not opposed to the fugitive slave law. He was not in favor of abolishing slavery in the nation's capital. He did not desire to have Congress exercise the power of abolition. Among other Lincoln statements that Harrison marked for later use were, this is Lincoln speaking, "I am not, nor have I ever been in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. I am not in favor of Negro citizenship. I have no objection to the proposed Corwin Amendment prohibiting federal interference with slavery being made express and irrevocable. And my paramount object," this again is Lincoln, "my paramount object of this struggle is to save the Union and is neither to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it." So Harrison got into Lincoln deep, and a lot of these quotes people are not familiar with. And what's very interesting is this critical look at Lincoln that Harrison develops early. Later, aspects of it appear in a wonderful book by Lerone Bennett Jr., former editor of Ebony magazine, and which he came out with maybe 20, 30 years ago now. And then subsequently, some of them appear, I believe, maybe all, in a book by Eric Foner, who's a very prominent historian. But when I spoke with Bennett at a conference many years ago, he was not at that time familiar with Harrison's writing on the topic. So, it's interesting to share that information with him. Next slide. These quotes that I just cited by Lincoln would be incorporated in a speech that Harrison prepared over the next years and presented from 1911 until his death. In various forms, it was entitled Lincoln versus Liberty, Fact versus Fiction. The talk emphasized that neither Lincoln nor the North sought to free slaves, that Lincoln denied protection to slaves who became soldiers, and that without these black soldiers, the North would not have won the war. Years later, Harrison stated that when he saw his lifelong aim as quite different from that of Lincoln, he stated that he saw his lifelong aim as quite different from that of Lincoln. Again, that quote, whereas Lincoln's paramount object was to save the Union, not free the slaves, Harrison countered that his purpose was to free the slaves, not to save the Union. In practice, Harrison's political views came to mean, with a slight play on words, that he consistently supported black workers over and against the interest of any racist union, whether it was a racist labor union or the Union of the United States. Next slide. In February 1920, Harrison, while working for Marcus Garvey's, writing for Marcus Garvey's Negro World and maintaining a clause that he was not supposed to be delivering lectures, stepped outside those regulations to deliver a series of lectures at Liberty Hall, at Garvey's Liberty Hall, on Lincoln and Liberty, Fact versus Fiction. And in those lectures, he argues that Lincoln in particular, he emphasized that Lincoln was the country's greatest president, despite the fact that the current notion of him as a god was not supported by the facts, at least not those relating to us. Harrison argued that a morally reconstructed Civil War would properly emphasize the efforts of abolitionists such as Elijah Lovejoy, William Lloyd Garrison, John Brown, and Wendell Phillips. Next slide. Harrison saw the real cause of the Civil War as related to the economics of slavery, the necessity of its extension, and the conflict of interest, capitalist versus free laborers. He discussed attempts at compromise, ending with the proposal by John J. Crittenden, and analyzed why the South would not abide the verdict of the voters. In the course of his disclosure, he argued again that Lincoln was not an abolitionist. He had no special love for Negroes. He opposed citizenship, favored making slavery perpetual in 1861, denied officially that the war was fought to free the slaves, and refused to pay Negro soldiers the same wages that he paid white soldiers. Next slide. Harrison aimed to prove that Emancipation Proclamation did not abolish slavery and was not intended to, and it was issued not for the slaves' sake, but as an act to cripple the enemies in the South. He also sought to show that the war was fought for economic and not for moral reasons. The Republican Party opposed the abolitionist doctrines, and he offered to sell out the Negro in 1861. Lincoln is the Republican Party in that period, and that as late as 1864, the Republicans refused to pass an amendment to the Constitution abolishing slavery. Next slide. To prove his charges, again, Lewis quoted from the 1858 debate with Frederick Douglass. We can jump ahead. We've covered this. Next slide, please. He also had correspondence with other people on these topics regarding halfway down this page, regarding Lincoln's first inaugural address of March 4th, 1861, which discussed the proposed 13th Amendment prohibiting federal intervention in slavery, to which Lincoln said he had no objection to its being made express and irrevocable. In other words, there would have been no federal intervention in slavery. And then he wrote to British workers, and Lincoln's response, in which he explained that the paramount object again in this struggle. So a lot of these quotes are very interesting. People can look at them when they get a chance, since this is up online now. Next slide. Harrison argued that these examples effectively dispose of any claim to our gratitude on high moral ground of altruism and benevolence. Again, this just goes into more about Lincoln's comments about Thomas Wentworth Higginson's role. And Harrison concluded by noting that his proofs were all documentary and the most damaging were Lincoln's own words. Next slide. Sorry, I didn't get to clean up my slides a little more. Very tired the last few days. Next slide. This is Irene Louise Horton Harrison, Harrison's wife. They marry in 1909. She comes from Demerara in South America and comes up through the Caribbean and various places in the Caribbean, including, I believe, in Puerto Rico, and comes to New York, and they wind up getting married and having 5 children, 4 daughters and a son, between 1910 and 1920. And it's one of the few pictures I have of her. Next slide. This is where Harrison moved to. He moved, when he left the West 60s, he moved to 231 West 134th Street in Harlem. When he lived there, it was the most densely populated block in Harlem. I went and took a photo of the building he lived in. They're up on the 4th floor, I believe. I took a photo of the building he lived in probably, I'm getting old now, probably 25, 30 years ago. And here it is. This is in a period of the crack epidemic, if you will. You can see a lot of broken windows and things like that. But when he lived there, again, it was the most densely populated block in Harlem. So Harrison's always living amongst the people. Next slide. He also started scrapbooks and book collecting in this period around 1910, 1911, 1912. And he ultimately, I've identified about or found probably 44 scrapbooks. And in his scrapbooks, there would oftentimes be a magazine which he'd put a little cover on and then paste files from newspaper clippings in them. And this is how he organized his thoughts. Today, we in a digital era, we have files, digital files, Word docs, PDFs, etc. He was using the technology at his disposal, but these scrapbooks are really fascinating and they're very revelatory. Help me, my tongue. And it's a major part of his collection. And he also began to collect books far more systematically. And he developed Harrison was a true bibliophile, and he began to amass a significant personal library. As a matter of fact, years later, Ernestine Rose, the librarian at what became the Schomburg Center, said that while Harrison was alive, there was no one who borrowed more books from the library than Hubert Harrison. He was reading all the time. And also, Harrison donated many books in the early period to the library. He and Schomburg and Young, who I mentioned earlier, the bibliophile, were some of the people who Schomburg gave the most major collections of materials, books, to the library, and it's found as it was developing. Next slide. His book dealing, he was inspired by George Young and Arthur Schomburg and John E. Bruce, and he got involved in 1911 with with Schomburg and Bruce in particular in the Negro Society for Historical Research. And that was another important organization that he got involved with, and that sought to preserve African history, Africana history, and make it available. Next slide. In 1911, around the time he's moving into the Socialist Party, Harrison wrote, he wrote on Lincoln, Fact versus Fiction, in late 1911 and early in 1912. And his Abraham Lincoln lecture was fully developed, and he delivered it as Lincoln and Liberty, Fact versus Fiction, before the Brooklyn Philosophic Association, Long Island Business College. On February 12th, he spoke on Lincoln, the American, before the Workingmen's Circle in East Harlem. And then you see also in this period, in late 1911, early 1912, he's starting to publish in the Socialist press, Socialism and the Negro. Next slide. Okay, now we're into Harrison's political action. This will be the last section we're going to conclude with today. We're going to talk briefly about his work with the Socialist Party. Next slide. Harrison, as he's developing his political understanding, he grows critical of Booker T. Washington, whom he considered to be a subservient. And he documents this in various things. He has one whole scrapbook dedicated to Booker T. Washington under the heading Subservience. And Booker T., for those not familiar with him, at one point said regarding President Theodore Roosevelt, "I will oppose nothing that he wants done and will help forward all that he desires to have done." And Booker T was the most powerful black man in the U.S. by virtue of his ties to powerful whites. So Harrison develops critiques of Booker T. Washington. Next slide. Washington was aided in his work by Emmett Scott, who's standing above him here in this photo. And together, through their efforts, they had Hubert Harrison fired from the post office in 1911. Booker T had gone to Europe and issued some statements on conditions of African Americans and stated essentially that conditions were not bad, they were fine back home. And W.E. Du Bois put together a group of over 50 people, wrote letters of protest. And Harrison, while still working in the post office, wrote 2 letters to the New York Sun, essentially saying, Booker T, you're free to say what you want, but you should tell the truth. And then these 2 fellas and others, and a fellow named Morgan, who's the postmaster for New York City, and who to this day, the big post office on West 38th Street, Morgan Station, is named after, got together. It was mostly Scott and Morgan got together, and they had Harrison summarily fired from the post office. Harrison had a clean POD 7. That's the Post Office Department 7. It's the record. As a longtime postal activist and steward and union official, I know how to access this from St. Louis, from the Postal Archives. He had a clean record, and he was summarily fired. And it was a devastating blow. You know, Harrison had written these words, and Harrison lost a steady job that helped support him and his wife and children. And for the remainder of his life, basically, he was living at the edge of poverty. Next slide. Harrison also developed criticism of the NAACP. In his first decade in New York, he considered himself a Du Bois man because Du Bois was critical of Booker T. Washington. But as time developed, he developed criticisms of the NAACP and Du Bois. And one of the main things he thought was that the NAACP had no answer to what happens if these white minds you are trying to reach remain unaffected. He thought the NAACP was limited by white people's views of how Black people should act. Next slide. Du Bois was editor of the NAACP's Crisis magazine. Next slide. This is around 1910. And Du Bois, as people probably know, was an advocate of the talented 10th, the educated and gifted who must be made leaders of thought and missionaries of culture among their people. Harrison was critical of this concept. Again, Harrison was a man of the people. And he didn't think the talented 10th had provided the leadership that was needed. He thought that they should come down from their Mount Sinai's. And he didn't think that the, quote, colored leadership that was implicit in this talented 10th was preordained to lead the Negro people. Next slide. He moves by 1911, 1912 into the Socialist Party. Socialist Party was in a period of rapid growth. In 1908, it had 40,000 members and got 3% of the vote. By 1912, it would get 6% of the vote. Its program included nationalization of industries, 8-hour workday, graduated income tax, women's suffrage, public works program, a lot of things we could probably still use today. Next slide. He wrote the first major series on the Negro and socialism by a, quote, Negro in the Call, the New York paper, in 1911, and followed that up in 1912 by a series in the International Socialist Review, the leading monthly of the Socialist Party. In Harrison's Call series, it was the first such effort at a comprehensive analysis by an African American. Next slide. As a socialist theoretician, Harrison argued that racial oppression was socio-historical, not biological. That he proposed a new litmus test for socialists, that they should champion the cause of African Americans as a revolutionary doctrine. He emphasized the duty of all socialists and all to oppose race prejudice, and he initiated a colored socialist club and emphasized the need for special appeals to reach African Americans. And he does this in a period when there are women's organizations and foreign language federations. You know, the socialists have organizations for different other groups, but they hadn't been doing anything with the Black population. And he initiates a colored socialist club, but after a short period of time, they pull out support from him and they no longer support it. But next slide. There were two factions in the Socialist Party at that time, the political or revolutionary socialists and the industrial or revolutionary socialists. The political advocated, oh, we've got to get more votes. We've got to move to socialism by getting socialist candidates elected. And the revolutionary socialists said we need more militant actions and revolutionary struggles. And Harrison answered to both of them. The duty to champion the cause of the Negro is the answer to why no socialism in the U.S. If you want to get votes, you need Negro votes, quote. And if you want revolutionary action amongst the working people, you need black workers. To him, it was very clear. Next slide. Harrison challenged the two main ideological props of white supremacy that were prevalent in the Socialist Party. The idea that racism is innate among some in the Socialist Party, most actually, and the idea that white workers benefit from race prejudice. If racism is innate, you're not going to get people to oppose it. And if white workers benefit from it, you're not going to get them to oppose it for the most part. He understood the white ruling class benefits, but workers do not benefit. Next slide, please. Harrison offered a very important, we only have a few more slides here now. He offered a very important insight in some articles he wrote in 1911. He wrote, politically, the Negro is the touchstone of the modern democratic idea. The presence of the Negro puts our democracy to the test and reveals the falsity of it. True democracy and equality implies a revolution, even startling to even think of. A touchstone is a black stone. You rub the metal against the black stone to see if it's really the gold it purports to be. Harrison says, you think you got democracy? Let's put it to the test. How are black people faring? Housing, unemployment, education, healthcare, etc. And then let's base our actions based on how we're falling short in those areas. But it's a very profound statement, I think. Next. He proposes in 1912, in one of his articles in the International Socialist Review, the duty of the party to champion the Negro's cause is as clear as day. This is the crucial test of socialism's sincerity. A year later, W.E.B. Du Bois in the New Review writes, the Negro problem then is the great test of the American socialist. But Du Bois gets much attention for it, but it actually comes out a year later. And Du Bois, by this time, is out of the Socialist Party, by the way. Next slide. Harrison also writes in the International Socialist Review, and this is very important, the 10 million Negroes of America form a group that is more essentially proletarian. And under slavery, they were the most thoroughly exploited of the American proletariat. Next slide. Again, Du Bois in 1935 writes, yet the white labor movement, with but few exceptions, never realized and never had the intelligence or knowledge to see in black slavery and Reconstruction the kernel and the meaning of the labor movement in the United States. This understanding of enslaved black labor as proletarian is of great importance. Next slide. And we see it in both Harrison and Du Bois. Because if we understand enslaved black labor as proletarians, as workers, it provides examples of some of the most valiant struggles in labor history. It helps us to tear the covers from centuries of white labor betrayal and apologists. Oh, well, they're not laborers, blah, blah. And number three, it helps us to understand the invention and role of the white race as a ruling class social control formation in response to labor solidarity. And this is a theme that I talk about in a number of my videos, and it is developed based on the work of Theodore W. Allen and his invention of the white race. Next slide. Harrison also offered some comments. Rudyard Kipling wrote The Black Man's Burden. Harrison responded. Rudyard Kipling wrote The White Man's Burden. Harrison responded with The Black Man's Burden. Next slide. In 1912, Eugene Debs ran for president of the U.S. on a socialist ticket. Harrison was tireless. He campaigned as many and spoke on the streets as many as 23 times a week, morning, noon, and night, for Debs and the socialists. He poured his heart out for the socialist cause. Next slide. Here's Harrison's response to And then at the Socialist Party convention in 1912, after he had put forth that the duty of the party to champion the Negro is as clear as day, Southernism or socialism is how he phrased it. The party came back with a response. Next slide. And they didn't even discuss the Negro question at the convention, but they discussed Asian immigration. And basically, it was one of the worst position papers that they took in the history of the Socialist Party. And they said, class consciousness must be learned, but race consciousness is inborn and cannot be wholly unlearned. That's the racism is innate position that Harrison was so opposed to. Next slide. Of great interest, I think, during that 1912 election is this. On September 14th, 1912, the New York Times reported on Hubert Harrison going down to the corner of Broad and Wall Street in front of the stock exchange at 1 p.m. in the afternoon, and he spoke for 3 hours on socialism as far as the voice could reach. Nobody had ever seen anything like this, and the crowd reached that far, right? And I refer to this with hindsight as an early Occupy Wall Street. Next slide. Harrison emphasized another key concept from Harrison is the twofold character of democracy in America. And we will come to this again in subsequent articles. And by twofold character of America, democracy in America, I want to emphasize that what Harrison emphasized. If quote, democracy is a lily white or white supremacist democracy, it is a retardant to social change. That's why when Woodrow Wilson says, I'm going to make the world safe for democracy, and he doesn't plan to include African Americans at all, that's a retardant to social change. But if it is a genuine and thoroughgoing democracy, it is a catalyst for radical social change. And this twofold character I draw from a statement from Karl Marx when he's writing to Engels on the character of labor, when he's describing his major work, Capital. It's very interesting for those people who want to think more deeply on these topics. Next slide. Henry Miller would watch Harrison speak on the street corners while he was with the Socialist, and he referred to him as his quondam idol. Henry Miller was a noted literary talent for much of the early 20th century. Next slide, just a few more. Henry Miller writes a glowing tribute on Harrison's oratory. There was no one in those days who could hold a candle to Hubert Harrison. With a few well-directed words, he had the ability to demolish any opponent, and so on. People can read this full thing as they look at the slides later on. Go on. Next slide, please. Harrison then supported the Industrial Workers of the World. That was a group to the left of the Socialist Party. They called for one big union. They industrial unions over racist and exclusionary craft unions. They organized skilled and unskilled workers. They advocated racial equality and an end to segregation and integrated meetings. They were proponents of direct action. They defended sabotage, and they organized 25,000 Brotherhood of Timber Workers, black and white, in the Deep South. Next slide. In 1913, Harrison went out to the major labor struggle in the U.S. that year in Paterson, New Jersey, the Paterson Silk Strike. And here he is sitting in the front row alongside Elizabeth Gurley Flynn and Big Bill Haywood, leading labor agitators. And they had to speak and hailed him because they were outlawed from speaking in Paterson. And he spoke in support of the Paterson strikers. And the Paterson press said, of all the speakers on the Paterson strike, Harrison was the most militant. Next slide. So, last slide. But Harrison, by 1914, was leaving the Socialist Party. He had had bad experiences. They hadn't supported the Colored Socialist Club. They hadn't supported his other efforts. They refused to put the program on the agenda at the 1912 convention. They didn't go, socialism or Southernism or socialism. They didn't address that very clearly, and a host of other things. So as he was leaving the Socialist Party, Hubert Harrison argued or put forth what is arguably the most profound but least heated criticism in U.S. left history. He stated simply, the Socialist Party, like the labor movement, has insisted on white race first and class after, and that it put the white race first before class. And I think if Harrison was emphasized more, if people knew more about him, and if he was available for people to learn from, we might have progressed much further, understanding some of his insights, such as that one. But thank you, Clemson and Darrell, for sharing this time.
Jeffrey, let me ask you a question. In terms of studying Harris, you can pretty much study African history and get insight to most of the issues and events that were taking place, at least during the period of time which he was alive. If you wanted, say, to look at Hubert Harris' comments on Booker T. Washington, his comments on Lincoln, particularly his comments on Lincoln, is there a topic? Is there a way you can go directly to getting information directly on what his thoughts and comments were on specific
Yes.
subjects?
Yes, very good question. I mean, it's not, the answer is not going to be so perfect, but this is the kind of thing which maybe some younger generation historian can really pull together fully. But if you go to my first volume, Hubert Harrison, The Voice of Harlem Radicalism, he talks about Booker T considerably, because Booker T dies during the life of that first volume, right? And if you go to my Hubert Harrison reader, I have some of his comments there. That's the best place to find information on his comments on Booker T. Right now, that's the best place, those two sites. And also, if you go to his papers, again, which are available online, and poke around, particularly in his diary, you might find some comments on Harrison. So it's going to take a little digging, but I tried to point to some of them here. And then, of course, in the second volume of my Harrison biography, I quote from his 4-part series in the Negro World, which were printed in the Negro World on Lincoln versus Liberty. So that's very informative, but it doesn't get into Booker T so much. But on Booker T, it's volume 1 of the Harrison biography, and the Harrison reader are the best places to go right now.
Jeffrey, we're going to look forward to our next session with you. This has been awesome. And that it won't be next week, but it'll be week after next. So we have 2 Wednesdays. I don't know the date though, but that takes us over into the middle of July, the first week of July. So I want to thank you. I want to thank everybody for tuning in to us. I'm going to ask you if you go and subscribe. Let everybody know about this lecture and all of the lectures that Tapvideo brings to you on a weekly basis, because we're doing our best to educate our community, to free our minds, and to help the world find peace. Again, thank you and good day.
Thank you.